Lucis Trust, a non-profit, non-political, and non-sectarian organization on the roster of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, and concerned with the establishment of world cooperation and goodwill, presents Inner Sight with your host, Robert Anderson. He, with Sarah and Dale McKechnie, President and Vice President of Lucis Trust, will discuss philosophical and spiritual topics essential to everyday life. Now here's your host, Robert Anderson.
Welcome. Inner sight is simply seeing that which is always present, but not yet fully recognized. You have, within you, the ability to see yourself and the world around you in a new way with new eyes. So, stay with us, and together we'll look at the world and ourselves with inner sight. Our topic for today, the United Nations. And before we explore this topic, I'd like to say a few words about Alice Bailey, the founder of Lucis Trust. And Lucis Trust is an organization that sponsors this show. And additionally, Alice Bailey wrote 24 books of esoteric philosophy, and those 24 books are the main inspiration for the dialogue that you hear in this show. The following thought is also from the works of Alice Bailey. When the United Nations has emerged into factual and actual power, the welfare of the world will then be assured. What is that welfare but love in action? What are right human relations but love among men, groups, and nations? What is international cooperation but love on a world scale? How did the founding of the United Nations come about, and also what prompted it?
That's an interesting point that people may not really be aware of. The theme of our last discussion on Inner Sight was how to respond to the suffering of others. And the United Nations itself was humanity's response to global suffering. The League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations, was formed in the aftermath of World War I by Woodrow Wilson. It didn't have a very long life. There were problems within the system of the League of Nations, and problems with nations being unwilling to sacrifice self-interest sufficiently to cooperate on an international level. Then there was the second phase of the One War, as Alice Bailey refers to it. We more frequently call it the Second World War. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, the United Nations was founded. In fact, it was founded in 1945, very soon, weeks after the truce in Europe was declared in April of 1945, and the charter for the UN was signed in San Francisco on October 24th, 1945. So we have just celebrated the 62nd anniversary of the United Nations. That was a war. World War II was a war in which an estimated 60 million people died.
Wow, that many?
60 million.
Well, that's unbelievable.
And the Soviet Union alone lost 20 million. It's staggering when you think about it. 20 million people. The United States lost 500,000. So there was obviously a keen awareness of human suffering, of global suffering at that time, and that prompted certain international leaders and people concerned with world betterment to come together and form the United Nations. It was a response to human suffering. And we have to remember that now when we criticize it and complain about it. What would you put in its place as a way to respond globally to human problems and human need, human suffering?
Yeah. And it's a response to, I think, from our higher selves, our better selves, to begin to come together and cooperate and to share and to express goodwill and to build relationships rather than build walls and start wars, because they never really solve anything. And it's the founding of the UN that gives us the opportunity to build relationships, and this is between nations, between people and between nations, and this is so very important for the future of the human race, because it is only in building right relationships and harmonious relationships that this energy of love, which is mentioned in the keynote, the energy of love can flow. And it can't flow where there are walls and barriers and wars and conflicts and separateness and isolation and selfish interest. This spiritual energy of love is our saving grace, and we have to build relationships in order for that energy to flow.
I don't know if it's commonly understood that nations can be a source or an expression of love between people, but we do have examples in the world. The Marshall Plan, in which the United States shipped tons and tons and tons of supplies and food to Europe in the aftermath of the war, the response of nations to the East Asian countries that were affected by the tsunami, the global efforts to aid countries in Africa. Nations can indeed be expressions of love. They can also be pathetically oriented towards self-interest. And so often that's what gets in the way when you talk about barriers and walls that limit the UN. Self-interest on a national level is a big issue. We haven't always had nations in human history. I think that probably the earliest expression of some kind of collective affiliation must have been the family, and then the clan, and after that a sense of one's tribe, which still prevails in a lot of the world today, an allegiance to one's tribe and not beyond that. Yes. Then in the last few centuries, nations have developed, and people have developed a sense of being part of a nation. George Washington, the founder of the United States, was really a powerful voice for getting the American colonies, which at that time identified with their region, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, or whatever, to think of America. So the achievement of a national consciousness at that time was a major step forward. Now we need to grow beyond that, and the UN is a collection of nations that come together. People often think that the General Assembly is going to be a place where the governments of the world are told what to do. And when that doesn't happen, they get very indignant and say, well, the UN is useless. But just imagine if the UN told the United States what to do. You'd never hear the end of it. Because sovereignty prevails. National self-interest is sovereignty. One's sovereign rights as a nation have to be respected. So it's a misunderstanding to think that the UN is going to be a form of world government. It's not. The phrase that often is said about the UN's role in governing is global governance. And that's an interesting point to consider. As I understand global governance, it's not passing laws that supersede or override the nations that belong to the UN. It's an effort to provide some kind of decision-making that will arise out of the member nations through consensus, through the willingness to set aside certain preferred objectives in the interests of a larger whole, and not just on issues pertaining to national policy, but to human rights, the distribution of resources, the protection of the environment.
Yes, all of that. And the UN is really an expression of human consciousness, of the expansion of human consciousness, really, because, I mean,